Welcome, everyone. I'm Raj Kumar. I'm the president and editor-in-chief of DevEx. Delighted to be with all of you joining us from all around the world for this event that we at DevEx are co-hosting with the World Economic Forum as part of the Davos Agenda Week. This is a week we normally would be in Davos, and we're happy to at least get a chance to be with everyone virtually, obviously due to the circumstances facing the world, something that we in this event and probably in every event this week has been discussed. Where I am today in the East Coast of the US, it is snowing and it is dark outside because it's early enough in the morning. So I do feel a bit like we're actually in Davos, which is nice, but the focus of this event is far from the Alps. This is an event focused on the SIDS, or the Small Island Developing States. And this is a group of countries spread geographically around the world, a lot of diversity among them, but many similar challenges. And in fact, here at DevEx, a media organization that covers global development, we've had a particular focus on the SIDS. For the last 3 years, we've been running a content campaign in partnership with the UK space agency called Turning the Tide. And our journalists have been covering the climate realities facing the SIDS and how they can become more resilient. Well, this was all before COVID hit. And now in the face of a global pandemic, SIDS countries have found themselves with a dramatic downturn in tourism, often a major source of revenue, other economic challenges, of course, the virus itself. And the idea that the World Economic Forum has been pushing forward, this idea of a great reset, has particular resonance for countries that felt like even before the pandemic, they needed something to change, something to shift. So we have a group of experts today from around the world, many from small island developing states, to talk through what this new reality can look like, how we get out of the present circumstances, and how we frame a new future to go from small island developing states to great ocean states, to think in bold and ambitious terms. So I invite all of you who are with us today to be a part of this discussion. Ask your questions in the chat. You can hashtag DevEx events and tweet at us at DevEx. I'm at Raj_DevEx. We want you to be a part of this discussion, and we welcome you wherever you are from around the world, or whatever time zone you might be in. I know there's some late nights and early mornings joining us today. I'm about to begin our first part of the session. I just want to mention who all is with us today. We have a panel that will join us shortly, including Jorge Morier da Silva, the Director of the Development Cooperation Directorate at the OECD, Marine de Basileir, who is the Group Advisor on Natural Capital at HSBC Holdings, Zara Khan, the Director of Programs and Initiatives at the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, Valeria Raimundo Orlando, who's the partner and co-founder at Green Square Ventures, and then ultimately at the end of the session, we'll hear from Lord Ahmad, who's the Minister for South Asia and the Commonwealth at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office at the UK. But we're going to begin with a one-on-one conversation, a kind of fireside chat, as we're calling it, with Prime Minister Alan Chastanet, who is the Prime Minister of St. Lucia. Prime Minister, it's great to see you. I love the backdrop. We get a sense of where you are in the world, and I appreciate you taking some time to be with us during this Davos Agenda Week.
Great, Raj. Thank you so very much, and it's great to be here with you. And as much as I would love to be in Switzerland, I have to say, to being here in St. Lucia at this time of the year is a joy.
Yeah, I'm sure. And in fact, maybe we can just begin there, because many people would love to be there, but presumably you've seen far fewer people visiting your beautiful country during this period. What has the pandemic meant in terms of adding an additional layer to an already challenging picture as you try to chart the economic development of your country?
It's been pretty catastrophic, as one can imagine. Tourism is 40% of our direct to our GDP, about 65% when you include all of the other indirect sources. It's 85% of our foreign exchange. And this just came upon us very suddenly. So by the end of March, pretty much globally, everybody had instituted quarantines to travel back to their country, which meant that flights stopped. The only other time in my life I've seen this is when we had 9/11, where the airline industry was really shut down for 12 days. So pretty catastrophic. We've seen a drop of about 50% in our tax revenues. We have seen unemployment increase significantly. And probably the biggest one is to the amount of borrowings we've had to make very quickly to make up that tax revenue shortfall has certainly weakened our debt to GDP number. So we've gone from 59%, was just under our prudential level, to 85% in a matter of 8 months.
And this was already a big problem for small island developing states, because if you imagine the climate crisis, the storms, you have one-off storms, hurricanes, typhoons that hit a country, you need to suddenly have resources to deal with that. Plus, you're thinking about building sustainable infrastructure that can last for the next generation. So kind of layer in for us, how are these different challenges hitting you at the same time? What does it mean for your development plans?
So really, exogenous shocks are the ones that really are impacting small island development states significantly, because there are certainly large enough events that they, relative to our GDPs, and are in absolute terms the amount of money that we have, it's just very difficult. So if we go back and start with the financial crisis in 2008 to 2010, there are things that would have affected SIDS that most persons wouldn't have understood or appreciated. So Bear Stearns and the Icelandic banks, as an example, that went into receivership. Many of the projects that were being undertaken here at the time collapsed. And because of the financial status globally, to refinance them was impossible. And then to add insult and injury, the receivers of those companies had to come in and try to recover as much of the asset that they could. And so, for instance, St. Lucia, we're still dealing with the receivership of 2 of the Icelandic projects in 2020. The next big one really was climate change. And climate change, with it, has a couple of issues, again, that persons would not necessarily readily appreciate. So one with climate change is the idea of building resilience. So we know that adaptation is a critical component for us. But in financing that adaptation has had to come out of our own resources, because many of us, our per capita GDPs are high enough that we are excluded from getting access to ODA funds.
Yeah, explain this kind of, there's a catch-22. You're basically too rich to tap into the funds that would normally be associated with helping countries through a crisis like the climate crisis.
Yeah, the classical one was the UK, and when Boris was the head of foreign affairs, and Priti Patel was the head of development, they were trying to help Anguilla and BVI, but because of their per capita GDPs, they couldn't even use their own ODA funds to be able to help them because of the definition that was in place. So we have adaptation, then we have mitigation, and mitigation is about reducing carbon emissions. The SIDS, which there are about 44 of them, are less than 0.5% of the emissions globally, but yet we're being asked to reach the same standards as everyone else. Now, when you're investing money into both mitigation and resilience, the returns on that investment aren't sufficient. So we're accumulating debt on our accounts and not getting the requisite economic activity to help us grow to recover some of that debt. We then have the recovery. So Bahamas, in recovering Grand Bahama after Doreen, hundreds of millions of dollars. And again, a 50,000 per capita GDP. So very tall order to try to achieve. And remember, these are things that are unplanned, and so therefore have to find space in your recurrent budget, which is virtually impossible. Then now you add COVID on top of that. So we were already in a debt crisis, and now you bring COVID where we've lost free capital. So tax money is free capital. So when you lose, 50% of your revenue because of what has happened, which you have no control on. I mean, we all understand what's taking place, and we're not blaming anyone, but the reality is we couldn't plan for this. So
well, and unlike September 11th, which was another shocking event that you say aviation was shut down for 12 days, this has been a much longer duration period. So the financial requirements for your government are much, much higher.
Yeah, absolutely. And the bigger question becomes that the credit rating agencies are not only going to downgrade you because of now the sudden sharp rise in debt in your per capita debt, your debt to GDP, but also what's the future hold? So, credit ratings hate uncertainty. What's tourism going to look like post-COVID? What's going to be the fallout after the vaccines are given? How many businesses are going to survive? And so how do you make those projections? So I'm sitting here actually putting my budget together right now. The one number I can't say with any kind of certainty is what's my revenue going to be. So in essence, I just have to pick a number and then on a daily basis, adjust my spending accordingly based on how much revenue we're pulling in.
Right, and you have the virus to contend with domestically, which also increases costs. I want to think about how do you get out of this? It sounds like what you're saying is the international financial system has been set up in a way that neglects SIDS. There just isn't a place where they sit logically in the system. They're too rich for the ODA funds. They're small, that you don't have the ability to go and borrow in the way that richer countries can inexpensively. You're dependent on other people's currencies and their own central banks and monetary system. So how are you getting out of this? I know you partnered with the World Economic Forum to try to do something around a comprehensive framework that you're hoping will be really a lesson that other countries can look to, that can provide a roadmap for other SIDS. What is that? What is that vision that helps to change this current structure?
Well, I think the World Economic Forum appropriately in terms of developing a country financing roadmap, and St. Lucia's very honored that we were selected as one of the states to start this process. And there are a couple of things. So one, for sure, from a process perspective, and you're 100% right, post-World War II, the institutions that came into being didn't take into consideration microstates. So many of us obtained our independence from England. Many of us are Commonwealth countries, and that independence didn't start until the 60s and completed in the 80s. So I think there needs to be a sit down to re-engineer how we're going to treat small island developing states in the global context. And that would be with the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, and certainly within Bretton Woods, because it's an impossible task, but yet there is a lot that we're contributing to the development of the world, whether it be this week we're having the Nobel Laureate Week in St. Lucia. Sir Arthur Lewis is a Nobel Laureate from St. Lucia, and Derek Walcott. So we're the highest per capita GDP of Nobel Laureates in the world. From tourism is an industry that is a quid pro quo, meaning that the source country benefits sometimes even more than we benefit from the expenditure. So there is a purpose of us. And then when we get into the discussion of the blue economy, the amount of land space relative to the ocean in this part of the world is higher than anywhere else in part of the world, and with SIDS in general. And so preserving and maintaining our blue economy, we play a very important role in that, and we need resources to be able to do that. So the World Economic Fund, in terms of coming out of the box thinking and new ideas in terms of how we can get the private sector engaged with the development of SIDS, and then even on our own, is to understand that we have to develop a sink fund. So not only do we have to have primary balances and an overall deficits within a particular amount and constrained and adapt what we call fiscal rules, but we also now must have a sink fund of free capital available to deal with these exogenous shocks. And we need time to be able to build that up or find some new revenue streams to help source that information. And lastly, certainly coming out of the pandemic, the digital economy is going to take off. I mean, I was so heartened to hear when Google said that all the persons who are currently working at home are going to continue to work at home. What that says to me is, are we now getting to a borderless multinational companies? So can a person from St. Lucia actually now, without having to go through the visas and all the other issues, once they have the skill set, work for Google from St. Lucia? And we're seeing nomads where executives are now realizing that they don't have to be working at their home. They can be working at other places in the world and still be as effective as they were before. So if we're going to make the investment, the infrastructural investment, both in terms of bandwidth capacity, adapting our education system to meet these new needs, that's going to require fresh capital. And I think that that's something we're looking forward to.
Prime Minister, one last point, because we're running out of time. I know that part of your vision is looking at how small island developing states can band together and work together. Tell us a bit more about that, because any individual country, any individual SID might be quite small in population and GDP, but when you come together, what are the opportunities you're hoping the international community will recognize?
Well, I think that that's something that's on us, right? I think that the first discipline to be able to develop the reserve funds, whether it's on a national basis or on a regional integration. So we have the OECS, or we have CARICOM, or we have the wider body of SIDS, where we're pooling monies together that we can help ourselves out. But certainly integration is critical, and the fight always is sovereignty. So let's take foreign affairs as an example. You know, everybody wants to have their own foreign office in New York, their own foreign office in London, their own foreign office in Washington, DC. But has the time come for us to now look at how we can share that cost? So there are a lot of things that we're doing in repetition. Our participation on critical entities, the ILO, the IMO, just to name a few. Do we now start participating as the SIDS? So what you're doing is you're actually reducing the cost of governance, but you're strengthening the result of governance. And that's really what you want to see happen. So there has to be deeper regional integration. And parallel to that is, how do we find how do we utilize the liquidity in our commercial banks? And how do we now get persons to be more confident about investing and these new areas? And the one that I know that you're the great expert on is on equity funds. Small, medium-sized enterprises cannot rely only on borrowing money. There has to be this equity fund, and that equity fund will not be done on, or to be successful on a national basis, it has to be on a collective basis. And whether that's the Caribbean, or whether it's the Caribbean plus the Indian Ocean and also Asia SIDS, all coming together with one fund. But we're going to have to now do things for ourselves to show the rest of the world that we are ready.
Well, you've given us some big ideas, Prime Minister, that we are going to dig into in the following panel. I love the vision that if you really think differently, maybe there's a way to change the dynamic. And if there's ever a moment to think differently, now would be it. So I look forward to seeing where your leadership takes these ideas. We're going to pursue them here in this discussion. And I hope to do this one day with you in person in St. Lucia, hopefully sooner rather than later. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so very much.
I want to invite our panelists to turn on their cameras and join the discussion. Good to see all of you. And we have panelists joining us from all over the world. And I guess I want to just pick up from where the Prime Minister left us, which I think was a pretty important call to action. He was suggesting that we need to really change the way we think, rethink the ODA rules, the Overseas Development Assistance rules, so that actually small island developing states fit within them, their realities fit there, to think about regional integration, to think about remote work and the opportunities that provides, to think about climate and all the approaches to it and how they might fit better for SIDS. So maybe we can just dive into your reactions to that. And Jorge, you're with the OECD, which sets these rules around ODA. You work a lot on private finance and blended finance and help to think about that global infrastructure. What do you take away from the Prime Minister's call, and what do you see happening in this space?
Thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be with all of you, and especially after this inspiring start with the Prime Minister. And clearly, we have to rethink the way we approach the sustainable ocean economy, both in a perspective of the risks that SIDS are incurring, but also untapping the potential that has been overlooked. So I hope that we can take this crisis as an opportunity, not just to take more attention, to dedicate more attention to the vulnerabilities that SIDS are facing, and Prime Minister is absolutely right. This crisis is just another crisis, but the climate crisis, the natural disaster vulnerability from SIDS, it has been quite eloquent in recent years. But I also think that we have to avoid the conversation that is just about ODA. Not because something is good should be ODAble. There are always ways of boosting partnership using concessional and non-concessional resources beyond ODA. I know that the ODA rules are a fundamental element. We know that this is a way to prioritize where resources would be allocated. And I also know that the seeds have been put in a paradoxical situation where in one hand they have been graduated due to the GNI per capita rule. That is not a rule set by the Secretariat of the OECD. It's a rule from the members of the OECD taken by consensus. But on the other hand, we know that the seeds, even after graduation, they are still very vulnerable. We have produced some research that confirms that, unfortunately, even for seeds that graduate in the year before graduation, on average, they still depend on 27% from ODA. This is not something similar to any other sort of countries. Normally, right, when you approach graduation, you are already very little dependent on that. That's not the case on seeds. So clearly, we need to take a perspective that is beyond ODA and ensuring that we, in one hand, for the seeds countries that are still under ODA, that we can take ODA as a catalyzer to foster blended finance, impact investment, private sector investment, so more and smarter ODA. But for the countries that already graduated, and this is a very important element for seeds, that even for countries that graduate, we will not lose partnership, and governments can continue collaborating and mobilizing innovative resources. I will have the time during the conversation to outline some ideas to untap the sustainable ocean potential, including based on some research that we have produced, but maybe I'll stop here to make sure that we have a live conversation.
Yeah, no, you started us off very well, Georgia, because we want to think about, yes, ODA is a piece of this puzzle, but you're suggesting we need a different framework where ODA is just one piece and we don't want to neglect the others. So Marine, maybe I can bring you into the discussion since you think about the private sector side. And many of these are countries that have tremendous assets, especially when you think about the blue ocean assets. What are the private investment opportunities and how might they fit with the development strategy of a country like St. Lucia?
Well, thank you for inviting me to this. Yes, how do we see seeds before thinking about the opportunities? I think it has been said, but it's important to remind a little bit. Yes, there are challenges in accessing financing for seeds. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't be around this table today. Majority of seeds are middle-income countries, as it has been said, and meaning that they are mostly not eligible to concessional finance, again, as Prime Minister said. And access to international capital market is restricted because of lack of creditworthiness, and a number of them are unsustainably high debt levels. So being said that, there are interesting initiatives to scale up for seeds, and that's more ideas that I will throw here than actual ready to use, even if some of them have been already in place. So there are some existing instruments that can improve the resilience of those countries, and I would namely think of insurance, bonds, investment funds, and carbon credits. And so for insurance, I mean, you know that in the Caribbean, but also in the Pacific Islands, you have dedicated insurance facility, which provide parametric insurance to cover natural disaster, earthquake, tropical storm, etc. There's probably more to invent here. Bonds. There is, as you know, a huge demand for bonds, and that sustainability bonds, blue bonds, green bonds, it's absolutely booming, and still the availability of investment proposition is lower than the demand. So there's great things to invent around that. And I would just name a few examples of great opportunities to link high quality nature-based solutions with debt instruments. as nature-based solutions are certainly one of the great instruments to support resilience of those countries while supporting not only the environmental but also the social resistance of those resilience of those countries. So among the examples, I think the first one is the Seychelles debt to climate adaptation swap, which is actually an illustration of creditors that actually agreed to discount the amount of the Seychelles debt. Funding came from philanthropic money and repayable loan, and the Seychelles debt repaid those loans to a specially created local trust with endowment in the form of an annual disbursement of, and that actually allowed to invest in marine conservation, but also allowing the perpetual investment in those marine projects.
It sounds, Maureen, like the idea there is that the assets, the ocean assets of these small island developing states are really global public goods in a way. They're part of our planetary assets, and so there's an interest in lenders and financial institutions to say we want to value that, so we'll actually in a way pay for it through a discount on debt. Do you think that's a scalable solution? Do you see that as something that could go beyond this example in the Seychelles?
Absolutely. I mean, we see it, and not only for seeds, actually. There's great potential, and the first example that I was going to touch on is actually the voluntary carbon markets, but you can think about other voluntary nature market. I mean, you may have seen that the Queensland state in Australia has issued coral reef credits, and it's also an instrument for companies to showcase their interest in preserving the natural assets, as well as for the state to actually ensure the preservation of those assets. So yes, there's a lot to think about that. And later today, as you may know, there's going to be the launch of the report of the task force on scaling the voluntary carbon market, which actually offers a game-changing framework to help those kind of instruments to develop.
Let me bring in our next panelist. I want to come back to you, Maureen, if we can, as we go. You've given us, again, much more to chew on here. And I like the word game changing, because that is exactly what we're trying to get into. So Zadok Khan, can I go to you? Again, you're with the Pacific Islands Forum. You're joining us from Fiji. Give us your reaction to what you're hearing so far. Do you feel like the elements are here for a plan where SIDS can come together, through regional integration and develop and scale some of these both, ODA changes and private sector investment ideas? Is that there yet, or do you see the situation as much more challenging than that?
Thank you, Raj. And firstly, I'd like to thank the Honorable Prime Minister of St. Lucia. I think his comments and his remarks were very much shared by the experiences that we face in the Pacific region as well, particularly when it comes to the issue of climate change and disasters in general. So I think through his comments, you would have seen that there's a very strong linkage in terms of the vulnerability of small island developing states, the issue of climate change, and the ability of our respective countries to develop and grow. And so we completely agree with his comments. I think on the issue of climate change and resilience, I'd like to draw on the example that we have from the Pacific region. So according to the World Risk Index report of 2019, from the top 20 countries in the world that are vulnerable to disaster risk, 8 Pacific Island countries feature in that index, in the top 20. And I think many of you may recall that there was a cyclone that hit Fiji back in 2016 called Tropical Cyclone Winston, which was the second most powerful storm that hit the southern hemisphere. And that storm caused about $1.4 billion worth of damage to Fiji, wiping basically 1/3 of the GDP of Fiji's growth, basically. And so what they did was, in a matter of just a day, Fiji had lost approximately 20 years of development. And so for a country of our size, which is dependent on tourism, very similar to St. Lucia, a country of less than 1 million people, our debt to GDP ratio was severely affected. And so with the onset of COVID-19 and the pandemic, our debt to GDP ratio went from about 46% to 81% in terms of borrowings. And so we very much subscribe to the thoughts of the Honorable Prime Minister in the sense that it appears that the multilateral finance institutions and the way that the global financing landscape is structured at the moment, it does not tailor to the needs of small island developing states, whereby natural disasters and the onset of disasters. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, we faced another Category 5 storm that hit Fiji, and we lost about $100 million worth of infrastructure. So in a matter of just a couple of years, we've had two Category 5 storms hitting Fiji. And this is not just unique to Fiji. We've got other countries in the region, Vanuatu, Tonga, Samoa, that have faced tsunamis, that have faced equally strong, powerful storms. And it's affected their ability to borrow effectively. We've also got countries in the region that the Prime Minister mentioned that have graduated as well to high income status, who are no longer eligible for ODA funding. So in terms of the solutions, I know, Raj, that you want to land on some innovative ideas. I think definitely working with the private sector, is a must. We're trying to do that in the Pacific region as well. I think, as the Prime Minister has said, the first thing we're trying to do is help ourselves. So for the Pacific, what we're doing is we're setting up an innovative financing facility called the Pacific Resilience Facility. We're working with our development partners to develop this facility and also link up with investment managers. We're looking at a $1.5 billion US dollar facility that can support community level projects in the Pacific Island countries, particularly in terms of building resilience, focusing on adaptation. I think many colleagues may know that in terms of the global climate financing resources, only 5% is dedicated towards adaptation. 95% goes towards mitigation. And I think it's by high time more resources are put to adaptation, and SIDS are supported by the global community in terms of financing these needs. Thank you, Raj.
Thank you so much, Zarak. And again, also, you've given us a lot to work on as we get into our broader discussion. I want to bring Valeria into the conversation, because you, Valeria, as a partner and co-founder at Green Square Ventures, work a lot at the intersection of what we've been hearing so far around the blended finance space, how you bring together government, multilateral institutions with private sector investors. What are you seeing in the landscape of investment opportunities for SIDS at this intersection of public and private?
Well, Raj, thank you very much for having me here. And it's a real pleasure to be again on a panel, both the minister as well as my friend George. George and I think it's been 2 years that we've been talking about blue economy and blended finance vehicle around the globe, and trying to figure out what is the most effective way to deploy the funding that is there. I think Marine really outlined the challenges that investors are facing when looking at SIDS. So you have a credit challenge, you have an asset valuation challenge, you have a debt challenge. But once we mention all of those, we have to start thinking about solutions. SDIP with the World Economic Forum has done a great job in the last 8 months with St. Lucia, working on creating a roadmap for a CFR. And the roadmap also shows a framework potential for possible projects, right? And so building pipeline projects that are aligned both with assets and a new asset valuation of the resources that SIDS have, because a lot of times these are undervalued, the natural assets, the marine assets, mangroves, coral reefs, fisheries. All of these things have been taken for granted by the SIDS themselves. And investors have not had the opportunity to see this as an investment opportunity or as an underlying assets. So during the Davos agenda, we've been hearing about stakeholder capitalism. We've been hearing a lot about net zero investments, about how to grow portfolios that are more resilient, that are geared towards sustainability. And so let's look at how to build pipeline of projects. There's plenty of impact funds out there that are able to invest lower volume, but building in projects that maybe align stronger with an SDG target, for example, where there is a microgrid project in St. Lucia or in other SIDS, or like what Palau did in Micronesia, which is a super tiny island. or in Fiji. And by building a microgrid, then you do have the possibility of probably hosting a greater global broadband system that allows what the Prime Minister was talking about in terms of allowing for a tech hub or for more technology to move in. Definitely working on an ecosystem-based adaptation, looking at the ecosystem, both nature and social. Maureen also mentioned that, how important the social community it is and how much we need to actually invest in the people and their skills and start looking at diversifying. Diversifying creates resilience. See, yes.
Valerie, we got a question. We're getting a number of questions in. We welcome those to keep coming. Sure. But somebody exactly on this point was talking about, of course, the challenges for children during the pandemic with school closures and the like. And we've been focused so much in our discussion so far until you just mentioned that on investing in the climate, investing in infrastructure. But what about social investments? And how do we ensure there's room for those?
It is absolutely essential to have social investment. If you're actually looking at true sustainability and resilience, and this is something that all the data markers are truly showing, that investments and portfolios that have greater resilience are those who are also investing on the S of the ESG, the social, and the alignment of that social with the SDGs. So how do you do that? You grow the experience. You start looking at, and this is something that the Prime Minister has mentioned during the roundtables this year, you start diversifying also the education system. You start supporting these children through this and giving them different opportunities. But this is also, and this is why microgrids based on solar and wind powered energy are so important, because it gives them freedom from classic fossil fuel dependence. It gives them freedom if there is a hurricane that hits, it might hit a part of the microgrid, but the rest of the microgrid works. This supports children so they're not completely disconnected if they have to study from home. This supports parents if they are actually working either in technology or if they can work from home. So the challenge is, how do we transform from a traditional way of looking and seeking financing into a non-traditional and a sustainable way to look for partnerships with private? Because catalyzing, in blended finance, we say we have to catalyze and mobilize private capital. But we often do not talk to that private capital to really understand what they want. And what they want right now is opportunity. All investors, and there's a lot of investors in the participants, as I could see, they want mispriced assets. They want value, but they also want a new type of business line. And they want to be able to report to their shareholders and their stakeholders and their own investors that they're doing good and that they're achieving a number of SDGs. So SIDS today have the opportunity to think a bit outside the box, reinvest in their natural capital, really look at how do we become more blue. How do we create a carbon market for ourselves? Because there's one thing that we forget, that their size, which can be a challenge, can be also an opportunity. Their size shows that whatever they actually enact is measurable. Easily, you can create metrics, you can create a toolbox, and that's where the OECD and the other development institutions, as well as other governments, and would be great if HSBC also would come in and help. Let's create a toolkit so we can support the creation and the alignment of projects that are financeable, that will give a financial return and a natural return and an impact.
There are so many great points in there we can pick up on, Valerie. I do want to open it up. And you know, one of the things you mentioned, thinking about the global context beyond SIDS, is there's the hunt for return in investments in a low rate, negative rate world. So people are looking for those financial returns. And at the same time, another big theme is ESG and the desire for shareholders and companies to play a positive role in the world. And maybe those two things, as you're suggesting, coming together, create a new opportunity for SIDS that wouldn't have been there a decade ago. So let me open it up to everyone else on the panel. There's interest, I can tell you, from people asking questions around the debt for nature swaps. They want to know more about how that works. There's interest from them on understanding how are investments in SIDS really sustainable in the long run if we think climate is getting worse and worse and worse and these weather events worse and worse. So yeah, what we've been talking about so far is really resonating with our audience. Maureen, go ahead, and then we'll continue. Please just jump in.
Thank you very much. I think to build on what Valeria said, yes, there is more demand than supply. And it's not only about return on investment. I mean, a lot of investors being in a zero rate or negative rate environment reduce their expectation. But a lot of companies, institutions, etc., committed to net zero. And to reach that net zero target, they will need at some point to invest in negative emissions. And there are not enough supply to meet the demand on that. And that means that we need to invest now in the future carbon offsets. We need to invest now in nature-based solutions because investors are willing to have the right supply when they will need it, but the right supply has to be high quality.
And Marie, you're thinking about things, just to put a point on it, things like coral reef restoration, that kind of a thing as a
Yes,
negative emissions project.
exactly. Also mangroves. I mean, there's a huge opportunity for mangroves that will help adaptation, mitigation, and also development of economic revenue for a lot of many populations around the mangroves. We have finance research released by Earth Security Group on the potential of mangroves around the world, and being it in terms of carbon sequestration again, but also to support for example, offshore winds, as it's the kind of natural infrastructure which will be cheaper than using cement or other things, but also to support catchments and other kind of economic activity. It's actually great. Being said that, we are starting to identify the solution. There is a demand to invest. As Valeria said, yes, we need to get the right framework on what do we mean by high quality, and then provide those opportunities for seeds, certainly, and other geographies.
I think in a way, Marine is making the point, Georges, that that we need ODA here. We need overseas development assistance, because she's saying we need to have projects. These take a while to develop. They will be bankable eventually with private capital, but somebody has to start developing them. How do you think about these nature-based solutions and whether overseas development assistance should fit into them and other forms of concessional finance, Georges?
Thank you, Raj. I think that complementing what Marine and Valeria said, clearly we have this challenge of economic diversification. So seeds, while they will continue, of course, taking benefit of tourism, they cannot rely on tourism as the main source of their economy. So all these elements that both Valeria and Marine mentioned about renewable energy, biotechnology, marine-based and natural-based solutions are vital for the future for this diversification. But I would like to somehow disagree, if I may, because in this conversation, I think it's good that we share different perspectives on this ODA-centric approach. So let me make again the case. It may look a bit strange because I'm in an organization that is the custodian of ODA, but I think that we cannot miss the fact that we don't have an issue on supply. We have $379 trillion available in the financial market. Only 10% of that goes to sustainability. So I think that rather than focusing on the $153 billion of ODA, one should ask, how can I shift one part of these $379 trillion that are available, and what should be the role of seeds, the role of donors, the role of international organizations. So I really think that there is a role to be played by seeds, clearly boosting structural reforms, creating the enabling context. Investment requires this enabling context. There is a role to play by institutions such as the one that Marine represents, so the innovative sectors as malaria from the financial supply, but there is also a role to play from the international organizations and from the international system, creating standards, creating regulation, ensuring good measurement. What you cannot measure, you cannot incentivize. And the problem is we have overlooked several of these flows. We know, for example, and that element was not known until 1 year ago, that only 0.8% of ODA is targeting sustainable ocean economy. So within 153, only 1.5 billion is targeting the sustainable oceans. But what is happening in the other financial mechanisms? Of course, we have seen excellent initiatives on debt, on syndicated loans, on impact investment, blended finance, guarantees, swaps, etc. But we still don't have the capacity to measure all these flows. I hope that we can work more on measurement, that we can work more on standards. We don't have one common definition of impact. We have several definitions of impact, and we can work more on policy kits. And I really think, to conclude, Raj, that these blue recovery hubs that the WEF and the Friends of Ocean Action and with OECD have been developed can be really a remarkable tool. I'm really glad that St. Lucia agreed to be the pilot. This can really create a framework for policy, for investment, for change, and I think that this is something that is fundamental. So not just ODA, so ODA and beyond would be key for this effort. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And it sounds like what's coming together is that there are real ideas, there are specific, tangible initiatives, pilots for actually doing what you're saying, which is, mobilizing that private capital, directing it to projects that support sustainability and revitalize our oceans and our nature. But at the same time, there's this urgency that we heard from Zarak, that we heard from the Prime Minister, that the debt is there now, right? These debt levels are growing today. The needs are immediate. The climate is shifting right now. The weather events are happening. So I guess, Zarak, just back to you. How do you feel about where we are today as a global community, these ideas that you're hearing, and what's needed to move it forward quickly at pace?
Well, thanks, Raj. I think it goes without saying that ODA, my apologies, and borrowing by countries will always be there. But I think one of the points that the colleagues were making earlier is the importance of the blue economy. So if we take the Pacific region, for example, and SIDS in general, SIDS control roughly 20% of the world's exclusive economic zone. And in the Pacific region, we control basically 60% of the world's tuna supply. But there's very little exports of tuna that actually come from the Pacific region. So basically the Pacific region is used to harvest the tuna, and most of the processing is done in Asia and other parts of the world. And this is something that we'd like to change. In fact, for the Pacific region, the returns we get from the tuna industry is roughly about $500 million US per annum. Now, this constitutes roughly between 50 to 60% of the national budgets for a lot of our small island countries in the Pacific region. So they rely on these tuna excess revenues to fund their social programs, the education, the healthcare, and some of the other immediate needs. A lot of these resources are not reinvested when it comes to, for example, equity funds or sinking funds that these countries could then develop to try and prepare for the future. So this is something that as a forum, we are trying to change in terms of mindsets. We're trying to see how we can extract more value from our natural resources sustainably, and ensure that in the future, a lot of the value in the value chain is retained in the Pacific region. And I think another example I'd like to use is the recognition of SIDS, particularly at the multilateral fora. So in an organization like the WTO, for example, SIDS have no formal recognition. And we are negotiating something called the WTO Fisheries Subsidies Agreement at the WTO at the moment, which is very crucial for countries that rely on the blue economy and fisheries in particular. And we have a number of developed countries that are blocking proposals, for example, that are coming from SIDS. So I think just going back to the point the Prime Minister was raising, I think it's important for SIDS to work together, particularly when it comes to coordinating at the multilateral fora and ensuring we benefit from the blue economy.
Well, I interviewed not long ago the incoming head of the WTO, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, and she says fisheries is going to be a priority. So maybe that will be a new opportunity, as you outlined. We don't have that much time left, just a few minutes, but I want to bring others in. Anything else you want to comment on, Valeria, for example, or Marine? Go ahead, Marine.
Yeah, actually, on the fishery thing, Planet Tracker has proposed a blue bond that could actually be used to finance the replenishment of fish stocks actually by subsidizing fishing firms to reduce capacity to allow population recovery. I think a mechanism that would also go all to the as you said, Zarak, the transformation of the fish would actually be a smart solution. Again, I mean, we need innovation, we need to work together, and probably also aggregation of projects to get the size that is needed by the private sectors.
Valerie, before you jump in, I just want to throw one other thought on the table because we're getting great questions. And one is about China and their role. You know, Zarak talked about the Pacific region and Asia and the tuna industry. Of course, China has a different development model in the West, a lot of debt infrastructure projects in the Pacific. So if anybody has a thought about that too, we just want to add that to the mix of topics we're here to discuss. Go ahead, Valeria.
Should I answer the question, or I wanted
to
follow up with what Marine was
going to go?
I would like to follow up a moment with where Marine was going, because I think that there are debt structures out there that are really very interesting. With the EU taxonomy taking shape and hopefully being approved by June of this year, that will give a set of principle and regulation also for the blue economy, which hasn't had any, because unfortunately green has ICMA and the green bond principles, but the blue have been left sort of unchallenged, let's say. UNEP-FI is also looking at this initiatives with their Sustainable Blue Economy Finance Initiative and principles, which is very interesting because it serves as a backbone. I think that I agree with what George was talking about, is what is the role of international development organizations today, how to catalyze more private participation is by creating an enabling environment, by providing the resources to build these toolkits, because the Prime Minister, as well as Fiji, everybody needs the resources. What are ESG metrics? What are the metrics that investors need in order to report to their shareholders? How do you engage investors? What kind of measurements do they need in order for them to include them into their portfolio or their funds? All these things, these small SIDS do not know and do not have the capacity internally even to start engaging a lot of times with foreign investors. And so if you're looking at non-traditional and at sustainability, you really want to start supporting SIDS in this way. Open their networks, create more opportunity for them to speak. So this is a great opportunity for St. Lucia to shine. And I do have to say, SDIP has done a great job in bringing in so many people at these roundtables so that St. Lucia could really talk, but this needs to be done for all SIDS. So there needs to be greater also partnerships. We need to stop thinking about just predatory investments, and we need to start looking at long-term sustainable investments. So if we're really looking at stakeholder capitalism, then we need to look at long-term partnerships for investments. So let's try to get more attractive investors who are smaller. And then we'll build up to the institutional investor, who I know are actually listening in today. We need to then bring them in, because otherwise those trillions that George just mentioned are not going to come. But they will come the moment that the enabling environment is there, the moment that the assets are there, that we can create volume. And blue carbon, as Marine said, it is a way to create volume, because blue carbon can be generated through mangrove restoration. Also coastal resilience. Aura does a great job at looking at coastal resilience, and there are projects in creating debt structures to invest in the resilience of these islands towards climate. And for China, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer.
That's fine. And I don't think we're going to get there yet because we only have a couple of minutes left, but I did want to ask the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, I know has been listening into the conversation and seeing the questions that are coming in. If he wants to rejoin for just a moment, we only have maybe a minute or two, but I'd love to get your take, Prime Minister, on what you've heard and anything else you want to add.
Raj, I want to really thank everyone. I thought that it was a very fruitful discussion. And I think that some of the issues that we're confronting really came out here, and the difficulty in solving these problems. So maybe if I could just summarize things in 3 points here. First of all, I think it's clear that we can categorize the crisis as being catastrophic debt, and catastrophic debt being these exogenous shocks, the financial crisis, the issue of climate change and how do we fund that, and now with the pandemic. And with the pandemic, there are really 3 things that have caused the crisis. One clearly is the shortfall in tax revenues, free capital I've spoken about. The second one is the rollover of our existing debt. So for instance, St. Lucia had $900 million in bonds in our currency that we had to roll over. And not all of that was rolled over. Some of it was redeemed. So 25% of that was redeemed. So we had to find $175 million in cash in this crisis to be able to meet that obligation. And then the third one was really the incremental cost of COVID itself. So new respiratory centers, new medicines, and all the protocols that we've had to put in place, the PPPEs, to be able to meet that. So that has left a significant cash gap. So the question becomes, what's the solutions? How can we find a way to fund this catastrophic debt? Because if it was not for the catastrophic debt, the SIDS are fine. And we then accept our responsibility in this global world as grown-ups. But that this catastrophic debt is strangling us. And a classic example, Raj, is really climate change. So carbon tax, fantastic idea, because people should pay for what is no longer considered a free good, carbon emissions. If you put the tax on at the pace of production, so let's take America's example, they have broad enough shoulders, they can take this. The carbon does not remain in their hemisphere. It goes into the global hemisphere. So what portion of the tax is going to remain in America? What portion of the tax is going to come to the SIDS? Why the SIDS? We're on the equator. So we're feeling the effect of global warming faster than anybody else. And we're not the ones emitting, so we can't control our own destiny. By us reducing emissions is not going to reduce the threat. The emissions have to be reduced at the source. And so therefore the funding, and so the Paris Accord was about giving us money, which has never manifested itself. The third part, which is the solutions, which I'd like to end
on.
Go
quickly if you can, looking at the clock, please, Prime Minister. We just
the solutions really are meeting our potential. St. Lucia measures its output by output per square mile. So we take our GDP and look at our square miles and divide it, and we're underachieving. So how do we fulfill that? So the idea of diversifying from tourism is not the solution. The idea is to strengthen tourism and diversify your economy and take advantage of some of these new opportunities, but that requires real capital. That real capital is not accessible to us because we're dealing with the catastrophic debt. So I just want to say that there is a solution to be had, and forums like this will go a long way. And I really want to thank the World Economic Forum for allowing St. Lucia to participate in this. And I think that if we get minds together, we'll find that solution to the problem. But SIDS are a unique situation. I know that the global world hates hearing that, but we genuinely are. We're constrained by what we can do to respond. And I want to thank Raj for so eloquently bringing these points to the table today. And certainly all of the panelists, I very much enjoyed it.
Thank you, Prime Minister. We really do appreciate it. And it's a point we get here at DevEx covering global development. As I mentioned earlier, we've been covering this topic on SIDS for years now, and doing that in partnership with the UK Space Agency. So I'm particularly delighted to welcome our next speaker to the conversation, Lord Ahmad, who's the Minister for South Asia and the Commonwealth at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in the UK. We have short time, but we want to hear your points here. You've been listening to this conversation, Lord Ahmad. What's your takeaway from what you've heard so far? Where do you see the world of ODA, the world of blended finance, and the rest fitting into this picture for SIDS?
Well, first of all, thank you. And I thank DevEx and the World Economic Forum. And it was great hearing His Excellency, the Prime Minister. I mean, I joined slightly later, so I heard some of the discussion. And I'd just say from the outset that we're absolutely committed to small island developing states. And in that regard, we were pretty much at the forefront. We introduced recently, for example, the SIDS Hub with a mandate to provide better support to SIDS, particularly in these challenging times. And we've all been impacted by the pandemic. And I heard very carefully what some of the panelists were saying. I was scribbling down here issues such as non-traditional financing. As someone who was in the City of London for 20 years, it's always interesting to see innovative financial solutions. And our government is very much committed to working with key partners on the priorities for small island states, and particularly the issue which was mentioned by several panelists about accessibility of finance as well, which it's all very well making grand announcements, but how do small island states build their capacity to access that finance? Small island states, I also fully accept the premise, are more vulnerable to shocks. I saw it myself. I'm a former overseas territories minister for the territories in the Caribbean. I saw the devastation caused by Mother Nature. And we still too often, if I could sort of look at ourselves amongst other developed nations, still view development purely through the lens of income and dollar values. COVID-19 has perhaps reminded us that the world's more complex and there's various aspects we need to focus on which determine success. They remind us development, as we've heard again today, and I've noted that, is all about sustainability and living in harmony with our environment, and the issue of natural habitats, nature, and investing in nature is certainly going to be a theme of COP26. SIDS and the rest of the international community have much to gain from harnessing these assets and creating more sustainable and more resilient economies. I've seen myself, it shouldn't be. Some people frame it still as a choice. You either grow your economy or you look after climate change. But it's not that kind of binary choice. There are innovative ways, and indeed we see many small island states being on the front line of this, on seeing how they can address both issues. The question about existing approaches very briefly is, and help SIDS get to this point. Last year, the UK hosted a roundtable event with Fiji and Belize. And I think it sounds like, okay, you hosted an event, but it's not just developed nations holding it. It's how we're working in partnership with small island developing states. And we heard very clearly that many of our SIDS partners feel, as we've heard again today, that the international system is letting them down. It's not empowering them to build resilience, concern about how development is being measured and understood. And also, as we've seen again through Mother Nature, I remember using the example of Antigua and Barbuda, when Hurricane Irma and Maria hit at a stroke, and it was interesting seeing we had the OECD on the line today as well. At a stroke, the whole issue of a country's growth rates, its GNI, its GDP were wiped out. Now, where can we use ODA? Do they still qualify? And it's important that we're resilient and also dynamic in our response as well. But we must not forget the existential threat of climate change, and that's why we're very focused, notwithstanding the challenges of COVID-19, on COP. We saw with the UK the commitments made at the Climate Ambition Summit last December, which our own Prime Minister convened. And let me again address a couple of points I noticed. I think the point was made by Marine on the issue of adaptation and resilience. Well, that remains a priority. Prime Minister Johnson launched the Adaptation Action Coalition with key partners, Egypt, Bangladesh, Malawi, St. Lucia, the UNDP, and the Netherlands. And just a quick point on mangroves. I've seen myself, as you said in your introduction, I'm Minister for South Asia. I've seen the incredible investment the Bangladeshis have made in natural habitats, i.e. mangroves. And the recent cyclone that hit at the end of last year actually was tempered and mitigated by the fact that those mangroves did take effect. And thankfully, there was less loss of life. And I also, if I may, just coming on small island development states, particularly commend the Prime Minister of St. Lucia. It's great to see him again, albeit virtually today, for his continued commitment to this work. And just to end, if I may, a few points about what we're doing to stand by small island development states. We're already working to support economic resilience in partnership with nature, including through the Global Action Alliance. There's the Commonwealth Marine Economies Programme, the International Coral Reef Initiative, and the Commonwealth Clean Ocean Alliance, again, that with the Pacific Island, we're co-leading with Vanuatu. We're also, and I think this is important, I talked about finance and the availability of that. We'll be rolling out our new £500 million Blue Planet Fund that will help eligible countries, including small island developing states. Primarily, just to give you practical examples, it's about marine resources, looking at threats of climate change, marine pollution, biodiversity loss, and indeed overfishing. And we're also, I did it on behalf of the Prime Minister, not at last year's UNGA, but the UNGA before, announced a redoubling of our commitment in international climate finance to £11.6 billion. And we'll be providing more support for climate vulnerable nations. That comes back to my point I made right at the start. It's an issue of not just announcing, it's how that finance is accessed. But we do need, and I totally concur with the panelists on this, major international financial institutions to do more as well. And it means ensuring activities and investments are aligned with the Paris Agreement. I'm conscious of time, so I you know, there's much more I can say in this respect.
But
Let me assure you
done a
that
great job, Lord Ahmed, in summarizing so many of the key points that were made today. And I know and I'm sure others who are on the line here appreciate hearing the way that you brought it together and reiterating the commitment of your office. So thank you for being a part of this.
Real pleasure. And we look forward to working with you and indeed other key partners in this respect.
We do as well. I thank you, Lord Ahmed. I thank our panelists. I thank the Prime Minister. I think our partners, the World Economic Forum. This felt very much like a Davos session. Of course, it's part of the Davos Agenda Week, in that we had so many new insights and ideas, and I think we helped to underline the importance, the urgency, but also the opportunity that is in front of SIDS. So I really appreciate all of you, the great questions by the participants that were put forward. You know, the World Economic Forum has called for a great reset. And this is a moment when we really can think in a different way and think in a fresh way that's particularly relevant for small island developing states. It's something that we at DevEx have been covering, will continue to cover, because the opportunities here are at the intersection. They're at the intersection of traditional overseas development finance, at the intersection of traditional private investment finance, of different sectors, including adaptation and nature, biodiversity, tourism. These things all connect in an interesting way here in SIDS and present an opportunity if we can think in a different way. So I thank all of you for joining us and being a part of this, and stay tuned for much more on this topic going forward. Thank you and be well.